nice outfit. Not sure about his face, though.
I just want him.
Well, you can have him.
I see you have made your decision.
While preparing for this film, I debated with myself about what to go over in discussing Alex Proyas's The Crow. There's a lengthy backstory to the creation of James O'Barr's comic that, in understanding the background to that, makes the comic and the film have a bigger impact than it may otherwise have. The short story is that O'Barr was engaged to a woman and he had enlisted in the Marines in 1978. Before entering, though, his fiancée had been killed by a drunk driver. This event devastated O'Barr, and while living in Berlin in 1981, he began work on The Crow. He had hoped that the project would be cathartic, but this didn't turn out to work the way he had hoped. He told an interviewer in 1994, "As I drew each page, it made me more self-destructive, if anything. There's pure anger on each page." And it took 10 years for O'Barr to finish the book, with Caliber Comics publishing the first 4 books in 1989, with Tundra publishing the conclusion of the story in 1992. The comic was a large success and was eventually picked up for a film adaptation. O'Barr, when first meeting with the executives in charge of the film adaptation, learned they originally wanted to make a musical starring Michael Jackson, of all people. O'Barr laughed uncontrollably, thinking that they were just fucking with him, but he was appalled when he realized that they were being serious. It wasn't until star Brandon Lee and director Alex Proyas came aboard, and the movie became what it ended up becoming. O'Barr, ironically, wasn't originally on board with the casting of Brandon Lee. He'd only seen him in Showdown in Little Tokyo and was afraid that The Crow would end up being a kung fu movie and go straight to video. His opinion changed, though, when he met Lee on set in full makeup and wardrobe. He was also amazed by Lee's portrayal when he spoke the lines from the comics as is. Originally, Proyas wanted to shoot the film in black and white, like the comic book, and only use high contrasting colors during the flashback scenes. The studio didn't really allow for this, though, so Proyas worked around this decision by making the movie in a very monochromatic color theme, using red and dark grays. Production was troubled throughout. During the first day of filming in Wilmington, North Carolina, a carpenter suffered severe burns after his crane hit a live power line. There were other incidents, such as grip truck catching fire, a disgruntled sculptor crashing his car through the studio's plaster shop, a stuntman who broke several ribs after falling through a roof, a rigger who was electrocuted, a hurricane destroyed several sets, and a crew member accidentally put a screwdriver through his hand. On top of all that, according to Empire magazine, cocaine abuse was also rampant on set. Supposedly, cameramen were shooting while high, crew members were snorting lines in the bathroom between shots, and who knows what else. One crew member recalled an incident in which somebody sneezed on set, and an annoyed Brandon Lee remarked, "Someone just lost $50. The production suffered so much trouble that one of the neighboring productions in the EUE studios began taking bets on what would happen next, until several of their sets were destroyed in a fire. Ultimately, what this production of this movie would be known for in the annals of history is the tragic on-set death of star Brandon Lee. Originally, the flashback scene where Shelley and Eric are killed by T-Bird and his gang, there was a sequence where a revolver would be loaded and the hammer pulled back before being pointed at the camera. Because of this close-up shot, the dummy cartridges had real brass caps and bullets, but no powder. Typically, dummy cartridges are used for scenes such as this, but the film's props departments were hampered by time constraints, so they created their own dummy rounds by taking live ammunition, removing the bullet and dumping the powder, and then reinserting the bullet. The percussion primers were also left in place, and at some point, either during filming of the scene or after filming, the switch to the blanks. I've heard both accounts depending on the source. The gun was discharged while the dummy rounds were still in the chamber. The primer being set off was just enough force to lodge the bullet partway into the barrel of the gun. Those of you who are familiar with guns and how they work will know this as a squib load. The prop master removed the cartridges and loaded the weapon with blanks. The arms master, who should oversee this sort of thing, had left for the day, being sent home early. Whether through ignorance or oversight, the prop master didn't check the barrel of the weapon, so the obstruction was missed. Also, somehow the empty brass casing didn't raise any suspicion. The gun was loaded with blanks which contain as much as twice the amount of powder as a regular round for cinematic purposes. They set up to film the scene in which the revolver was to actually be fired at Brandon Lee from about 12 to 15 feet away. Everybody got into place and action was called. Brandon Lee walked through the door on the set as scripted. Michael Massey aimed the gun and fired at Brandon Lee as scripted. The squibs in the blood pack and the grocery bags that Brandon Lee was carrying went off as scripted. Brandon Lee fell to the ground as scripted. A cut was called and Brandon Lee never got up. He was struck in the abdomen by the bullet that was lodged in the gun barrel, mortally wounding the young actor. Lee was rushed to New Hanover Regional Medical Center in Wilmington, North Carolina, undergoing 6 hours of surgery. All attempts to save him were unsuccessful, and Brandon Lee was pronounced dead at 1:03 p.m. on March 31st, 1993, at the age of 28. In the wake of Lee's death, producers were faced with a decision. Should they continue with the film or not? Scenes already had to be reshot as the inclusion of the Skull Cowboy from the comic was deemed too tonally different from the rest of the film. They felt the cowboy just didn't fit. Paramount Pictures, the original distributors of the film, backed out due to the controversy of the violent content of the film in light of Lee's death. Miramax eventually picked up the film for distribution and put an additional $8 million into it to complete the production of the film. The cast and crew had taken a break for script rewrites of the flashback scenes that had yet to be completed, with Wallen Green, Renee Balser, and Michael S. Chernuchin being brought in for rewrites, adding the bookend narration and some new scenes. Lee's stunt double, Chad Stahelski, was used as a stand-in, and CGI was used to digitally superimpose Lee's face onto Stahelski's head. The beginning of the movie, which had not been finished, was rewritten along with the Shelley and Eric murder scene. The film was finished and released theatrically. In addition to Brandon Lee in the role of Eric Draven, the film also stars Michael Wincott as Top Dollar, Ernie Hudson as Officer Albrecht, Rochelle Davis as Sarah, David Patrick Kelly as T-Bird, Angel David as Skank, Michael Massey as Fun Boy, Lawrence Mason as Tintin, John Polito as Gideon, Tony Todd as Grange, Sophia Sheenus as Shelley Webster, and Bai Ling, Marco Rodriguez, Anna Levine, and Bill Raymond rounding out the cast. The film opens on October 30th, Devil's Night in Detroit. Police Sergeant Albrecht is investigating the crime scene where Shelley Webster was beaten and raped, and her fiancé Eric Draven was stabbed, shot, and thrown out of the window of their loft. To add even more heartbreak to the situation, they were set to be married the next day, on Halloween. Shelley, still showing some vital signs, is loaded into an ambulance, and as Albrecht is leaving for the hospital, he meets a young girl, Sarah, who tells Albrecht that Shelley and Eric were her friends, and that they took care of her. A year later, while Sarah is visiting the grave of Eric and Shelley, she's leaving and a crow lands on Eric's grave and begins pecking at it. After she leaves the cemetery, she happens across Albrecht at a hot dog vendor. Meanwhile, T-Bird and his gang are destroying a local arcade before rigging explosives in the building.
You know, Lake Erie actually caught on fire once from all the crap floating around in it. I wish I could have seen that.
While this is all going on, we see that Eric has been resurrected as he claws his way out of his grave before making his way to his old loft. He finds it empty and in shambles, having not been touched since the murders a year ago. Here he has strong flashbacks of the murders, and in the midst of these intense flashbacks, he runs for the window that he was thrown out of. We get a quick shot of T-Bird and his gang having drinks at the pit before we flash back to Eric mourning Shelley, before finally the pain inside of him builds up and he snaps. He begins painting his face to resemble a harlequin mask that he owned as he starts his quest for revenge. He heads out and he locates Tintin, the man who stabbed him upon entering the loft a year ago. He follows him into an alley where he confronts him and they begin to have a fight, with Eric eventually subduing Tintin. He takes his coat and he kills him with his own knives, leaving a crow symbol painted on the wall in Tintin's own blood. Meanwhile, T-Bird and Skank go to Top Dollar's club so that T-Bird can check in with him. We get a brief scene introducing Top Dollar and his girlfriend, sister. It's a weird angle. A brief glimpse into the fact that these two are kind of into like the occult and the supernatural. After this, we catch back up with Eric as he shows up at Gideon's pawn shop after learning from Tintin that he pawned Shelley's engagement ring there a year ago. Eric forces his way in and has a little bit of a standoff with Gideon before Gideon shoots him.
I'm looking for something in an engagement ring. Gold.
You're looking for a coroner. Shit for brains. Oh, shit. Oh, shit on me. Shit on me. Shit on me!
Eric proceeds to fuck him up.
Mr. Gideon, you're not paying attention.
After Gideon reveals the location of the rings, Eric begins to rifle through them until he finds Shelley's ring. On the way out, he kicks some gas cans over and gets more information out of Gideon about the location of T-Bird's gang. He has a brief little flip out before he tells Gideon that he's to send a message.
I'm not going to kill you. Your job will be to tell the rest of them that death is coming for them. Tonight. Tell them Eric Draven sends his regards.
Eric destroys the pawn shop.
They're gonna erase your sorry ass! You're nothing but street grease, you heard? Street grease, you motherfucker!
Is that gasoline I smell?
No, man. No! No!
Because of the explosion, police are obviously notified. Albrecht arrives at the scene and confronts Eric.
Police, don't move. I said don't move.
I thought the police always said freeze.
Well, I am the police. And I said don't move, Snow White. You move, you're dead.
And I say I'm dead. And I move.
Not remembering or recognizing who he is. Eric doesn't harm him though, but cryptically informs him who he is and he was the one that murdered Tintin, and that he's going to murder all of them before disappearing while Albrecht is distracted by some looters. Top Dollar and Micah are informed by Grange and T-Bird that Gideon's burnt down and that Tintin was murdered. Top Dollar wants to know who is responsible for Gideon's, not really giving too much of a fuck about Tintin. Flipping back to Eric, he comes across Sarah, saving her from being hit by a car while she's skating across the road. When she comments about skating in the rain, Eric says it can't rain all the time, with this giving Sarah the realization that Eric was the one that she was talking to. At the police station, Albrecht gets the case file for Shelley and Eric's murders and begins piecing together that he may have actually been talking to Eric Draven outside of Gideon's. Above the pit in Funboy's apartment, Funboy and Darla, Sarah's mother, proceed to get high off of morphine, only to be interrupted by a crow flying in the window, followed by Eric, who toys with Funboy a bit before causing Funboy to accidentally shoot himself in the leg, which he then passes out from the pain and being rocked off his gourd. Eric tosses him into the shower to wake him up, but Eric confronts Darla, and using his powers, he extracts the morphine from her bloodstream, telling her that her daughter is on the streets, making Darla realize that Sarah needs her to be a good mother. In a deleted portion of this scene, Funboy wakes up and attacks Eric with a discarded straight razor that Eric took off at Darla. Given that Eric had interfered with events that had nothing to do with his getting revenge for his murders, the wounds that Funboy inflicts with the straight razor do not heal. This was also the reason that when Eric shows up at Albrecht's in the next scene that he's in, his hands and his arms are covered in black electrical tape. This was kind of supposed to explain that, well, we'll get back into that. Eric proceeds to jam syringes in the Funboy's chest and overdose him on morphine before Grange walks in and finds the dying Funboy with Eric escaping through the window. Eric then visits Albrecht at his house, and Eric and Albrecht talk after Albrecht gets over the shock that Eric is alive, sort of. Eric says he doesn't know what he is and he needs Albrecht to tell him what happened. Albrecht fills him in and he says that he stayed with Shelley through the whole thing. Eric touches Albrecht's head and sees the events at the hospital through his eyes and feels the pain felt by Shelley during that time. Gideon is brought to Top Dollar in the meantime, where him and Grange have matching accounts of Eric, and Top Dollar, satisfied with the information he's been given, eventually kills Gideon and sends Grange to find out more. While waiting for Funboy, Skank and T-Bird are walking down the street. T-Bird sends Skank into a convenience store to get smokes and road beers before he gets in the car. The Crow lands on the hood of the car, and Eric sits up in the back seat and holds T-Bird at gunpoint, telling him to drive. Skank witnesses the event and runs out of the convenience store, getting hit by an oncoming car. He punches the driver after the driver assaults him and takes the car to pursue T-Bird. Eventually speeding past some cops in a parked alley, they begin to pursue T-Bird and Eric, too. After a decently long car chase, T-Bird loses the cops and Eric makes him stop at a pier. Using duct tape, he secures T-Bird to the driver's seat before dropping a white phosphorus grenade between his legs and putting the car in drive. As it drives off the pier, the car explodes, killing T-Bird as Skank watches from a distance. The next day, Sarah wakes up to find her mother making her breakfast in an attempt to begin repairing their relationship. After breakfast, she goes to Eric's loft to talk to him, saying she misses him and Shelley. Eric tells her they cannot be friends anymore, but he still cares about her. Meanwhile, at Top Dollar's club, Skank is informing Top Dollar of the previous night's events.
That's him. That's him. But he looked different. He was all painted up white like some kind of dead whore. I seen him. T-Bird, he sent me in for some road beers, right? And he took him away, but I chased him down. And he flashed right T-Bird to his fucking car. Oh, T-Bird, it's you, buddy.
Maybe we ought to just videotape this, play it back in slow motion.
And Grange confirms that Eric is alive, his grave is empty. A meeting that night between Top Dollar and his associates about Devil's Night.
I want all of you boys to be able to look me straight in the eye one more time and say, "Are we having fun or what?" Hey, you!
Huh?
What's your name, Skank? You don't feel that?
I feel like a little worm on a big fucking hook.
I feel like a little worm on a big fucking hook. Well, boy, your mama must be damn proud of you.
The hell that thing get in here?
Eric proceeds to walk in on the meeting, looking for Skank. Top Dollar refuses to give him up, and he orders everybody at the table to kill Eric, unaware that he is invulnerable. Chaos ensues, and as Eric begins fighting the gathered criminals, Top Dollar, Micah, and Grange escape during a gunfight. Eric eventually kills everybody in the room, leaving only Skank, whom he throws out of a window before being confronted by police.
That's all she wrote. Move and we shoot.
A chase ensues before Albrecht eventually finds him and tries to get him to safety. Eric bails out of the car as soon as Albrecht comes to a stop, trying to avoid hitting an oncoming police car. And in Top Dollar's limo, he laments the events that have transpired before Micah explains that Eric can be defeated if they can just take his power from him. Grange putting the pieces together saying, "Kill the crow, kill the man." Believing that his quest for revenge has been finished, Eric returns to his grave and finds Sarah waiting. They say their goodbyes and he gives Sarah Shelley's engagement ring. As she's leaving the cemetery, though, she's abducted by Grange. Through his link with the crow, he sees that she's being held by Grange in the chapel. Eric proceeds to go to save her, only for the crow to be shot by Grange.
Quick impression for you.
Caw, bang, fuck, I'm dead!
Top Dollar having a confrontation with Eric. Albrecht shows up and disrupts things, starting a gunfight in which Grange gets shot by Albrecht, but Micah and Top Dollar escape. Micah stays on the stairwell and Top Dollar takes Sarah to the roof. Micah wounds Albrecht in a shootout between the two of them, but when she confronts Eric, the crow, which she had picked up after it was shot minutes earlier, pecks and scratches at her face, causing her to fall to her death. Eric confronts Top Dollar on the roof and the two proceed to fight. After a while, Top Dollar seems to have the upper hand after stabbing Eric from behind with a katana. Before killing him, Top Dollar admits to Eric that what happened to him and Shelley was Top Dollar's doing. He ordered the building to be cleared. At this point, Eric grabs Top Dollar by the head, telling him he has something he wants to give him.
30 hours of pain. All at once. All for you.
Top Dollar falls and is impaled by the horns of a gargoyle statue. After saving Sarah, Eric tells her to stay with Albert until help arrives. He then returns to his grave, now truly done with his quest, and is reunited with Shelley. The film ends with the crow returning Shelley's ring to Sarah before flying off into the night. Before I get into anything else, let me start with a negative, which I don't even really know if you can call it a negative, but stated that the crow is the source of Eric's power. Originally, that wasn't really the case. Eric would remain invulnerable as long as he stayed on the path of revenge that he was resurrected for. Any deviation from this path would render him invulnerable, vulnerable. As I mentioned in the scene in Funboy's apartment, Eric took it upon himself to interfere with Darla and Sarah's lives. This was a deviation from his path, so when Funboy attacked him, the wounds didn't heal. Cutting the scene and cutting the Skull Cowboy character, who explains this to Eric, necessitated a change in the source of Eric's powers. The angle that the power comes from the crow does sort of work in this cut, but people often get confused with the final confrontation between Eric and Top Dollar. I always felt it was clear that by admitting that he gave the order for the building to be cleared, Top Dollar implicated himself as being directly responsible for Eric and Shelley's murders. Thus, this gave Eric the ability to do what he did to Top Dollar. I only explain this because I have talked to people that were confused by this. I love this film, and I highly recommend it, but at the same time, this isn't a film that I can watch as much as the other films that I've discussed. As much as I love this movie, it's maybe a once-a-year watch for me. While the movie could be said to have a good ending in that Eric Draven completes his campaign of carnage against those who murdered him and his fiancée, and he is ultimately reunited with Shelley in the afterlife, the tone of the film is not one of hope. The weight of this film would be crushing enough on its own given the subject matter, but combine that subject matter with the onset death of Brandon Lee, and this film is almost oppressingly crushing. While you can and most likely will enjoy this film, it isn't a film you generally walk away from feeling upbeat. The plot, while fairly paper-thin, it's a revenge story with a supernatural angle, but that's not what sets this movie apart. It's the characters and the setting are what really makes this film stand out. The Crow's version of Detroit is the bastard offspring of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner and Tim Burton's Batman, and it's done so amazingly well that the setting is almost a character in and of itself. The scenes in the movie are always visually interesting because of the gothic suburban wasteland. The characters are played to perfection by the actors chosen for the roles, specifically Brandon Lee's Eric Draven, Michael Wincott's Top Dollar, and Rochelle Davis's Sarah. Child actors can go one of two ways. Usually they're terrible or stick out like a sore thumb in an otherwise well-played cast, but Rochelle Davis is believable as the young Sarah in this film. And it's a shame she never did anything after this because it would have been interesting to see where her career would have went. Michael Massey was exceptional as Funboy, and it was a role that was originally meant for Iggy Pop, but he couldn't commit due to touring commitments. The character in the comic book was actually visually based off of Iggy Pop, and that's why they wanted him for the role. But I really can't see Pop in the role playing it as well as Michael Massey did. I don't generally note this, but for this movie I kind of have to. The soundtrack is stellar. Both the official film soundtrack with music from bands like Pantera, Rage Against the Machine, Helmet, the Rollins Band, and a standout performance by The Cure with the song Burn, which plays when Eric is applying the makeup for the first time in the film. And also the score by Graham Revell is hauntingly beautiful, but unfortunately, most people only zero in on the guitar licks that were written for the two rooftop scenes where Eric's playing guitar. I highly recommend you see this flick if you haven't seen it. It's an experience unlike any other, and it still holds up incredibly well to this day.